There are nights that feel larger than life, nights where the music is louder, the lights shine brighter, and the energy in the room seems almost electric. And for Kayla, this was one of those nights, the kind of night where everything seemed to align in her favor, where she stood at the center of attention inside the lounge where she worked, moving through the crowd with confidence, laughter trailing behind her as she balanced trays, greeted clients, and danced between conversations, completely unaware that, while she was living what felt like another memorable evening, somewhere far away, someone had already made a decision that would bring everything to an irreversible end, because long before the music faded and the lights dimmed, a plan had already been set into motion, one that would travel across cities, across state lines, and ultimately arrive at her doorstep with devastating precision, and like so many tragedies, it would begin in a place that felt safe, familiar, and ordinary, a quiet residential community where nothing ever seemed out of place, where neighbors passed each other without suspicion, and days moved slowly under the warmth of a tropical sky, a place where life was predictable, calm, and seemingly untouched by the kind of darkness that people only hear about in distant headlines. And yet behind one apartment door, a story was quietly building toward a moment that would shatter that sense of normalcy forever. Because Kayla was not just another face in that neighborhood. She was someone who left an impression wherever she went, someone whose presence carried warmth, whose smile had a way of making people feel seen, valued, and included. And those who knew her often described her as someone who avoided conflict, someone who chose kindness even when it wasn't returned, someone who carried herself with a quiet strength that didn't demand attention but naturally attracted it. And despite the fast-paced nature of her work and the lifestyle that came with it, she remained deeply connected to her family, especially her mother, with whom she shared not just a home, but a bond that had been built over years of trust, understanding, and mutual support, a bond that remained strong even as life grew more complicated. And like many young people trying to build a future, she navigated relationships that were sometimes unclear, sometimes casual, sometimes meaningful in ways that were difficult to define, connections that crossed distances and blurred boundaries, and among those connections was someone who would unknowingly become the center of a growing tension, a tension that existed quietly at first, hidden behind messages, social media interactions, and moments that seemed insignificant on the surface, but were slowly building into something far more dangerous. Because while Kayla moved forward with her life, focused on her work, her friendships, and the small joys that filled her days, someone else was watching from a distance, someone whose emotions were not rooted in acceptance or understanding, but in obsession, insecurity, and a need for control that would eventually spiral beyond reason. And what began as online hostility, subtle insults, and indirect confrontations slowly escalated into something more direct, more aggressive, and far more concerning. But like many situations that unfold in the background, it never fully revealed itself until it was too late, until the warning signs that once seemed manageable became impossible to ignore. And even then, no one could have predicted the extent to which it would escalate, because on the day everything changed, there was no dramatic build-up, no obvious sign that something was about to go terribly wrong. Just a series of small, ordinary moments that would later be revisited over and over again, moments that would take on new meaning once the truth was revealed. Because when someone came to check on her that day, expecting nothing more than a simple conversation or a routine visit, what they encountered instead was something that would immediately turn concern into panic, confusion into horror. Because the silence inside the apartment was not normal, the lack of response was not typical, and the moment the door opened, everything shifted in an instant, revealing a scene that was impossible to process, a moment so overwhelming that it blurred the line between disbelief and reality, forcing the mind to catch up with what the eyes were already seeing. And in that moment, everything that had once felt stable and familiar collapsed into chaos as emergency calls were made. Voices filled with urgency tried to make sense of what had happened. And within minutes, the quiet neighborhood became the center of an active investigation. As authorities arrived, secured the area, and began piecing together a timeline that would only grow more complex with each detail uncovered, because the scene itself raised as many questions as it answered, details that didn't immediately fit into a simple explanation, signs that suggested movement, struggle, and a sequence of events that needed to be reconstructed step by step. And as investigators examined the apartment, they began to notice elements that pointed in multiple directions, some suggesting a possible robbery, others indicating something far more personal, something driven by intent rather than opportunity. And as they followed the physical evidence, tracing paths, examining patterns, and documenting every detail, it became clear that whoever had done this had not acted randomly, that there was a purpose behind their actions, a presence that had entered with a plan and left behind a trail that would eventually lead back to them, but not before uncovering a series of interactions, connections, and hidden tensions that had been building long before that day. Because, as interviews began and statements were collected, a clearer picture started to form, revealing relationships that were more complicated than they initially appeared, connections that linked people across distances, and a history of conflict that had not been fully understood until now. And among those details was the presence of someone who had not been physically close until recently, but had been emotionally entangled in ways that were far from stable, someone whose actions in the days leading up to the incident would become critical to understanding what had happened, because witnesses began to describe unusual encounters, moments that seemed strange at the time, but now carried significant weight, including reports of someone moving through the building, knocking on doors, asking questions that didn't quite make sense, changing appearance in ways that suggested an attempt to avoid recognition, behaviors that pointed toward planning, preparation, and a calculated effort to control the situation. And as those details aligned with digital evidence, travel records, and communication history, the distance between suspicion and certainty began to close, revealing a sequence of events that was both deliberate and deeply unsettling, because this was not a moment of impulse, not a sudden act driven by circumstance, but something that had been thought through, something that had required time, effort, and a willingness to cross boundaries that most people would never consider. And as that realization settled in, the focus of the investigation shifted from what had happened to why it had happened, because understanding the motive was just as important as identifying the person responsible, and what emerged was a narrative rooted in jealousy, obsession, and a distorted perception of relationships, a mindset that transformed emotional conflict into something far more dangerous, something that justified actions that could never truly be justified. And as the pieces came together, it became clear that this was a story that extended far beyond a single moment, far beyond one location, reaching into the complexities of human emotion, the impact of unchecked behavior, and the consequences of decisions made without regard for their outcome. And while the investigation would eventually lead to answers, to accountability, and to a legal resolution, none of that could undo what had already been done. None of it could restore what had been lost, leaving behind not just a case file or a headline, but a lasting impact on everyone connected to it, a reminder of how quickly life can change, how hidden tensions can escalate, and how even the most ordinary day can become the beginning of something that no one ever saw coming. As investigators continued to dig deeper into the timeline, what initially seemed like a confusing and chaotic set of events slowly began to take shape into a narrative that was both chilling and disturbingly calculated, because every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every digital trace pointed toward a sequence that had been carefully constructed long before the crime itself ever took place. And as they traced the movements of the individual at the center of their growing suspicion, they uncovered a pattern that revealed not just intent, but preparation, a deliberate journey that began hundreds of miles away and ended at the exact location where everything would unfold, a journey that was not spontaneous or driven by emotion in the moment, but one that required planning, coordination, and a clear objective, because records showed that travel arrangements had been made in advance, transportation had been secured under false pretenses, and efforts had been taken to avoid drawing attention, all of which suggested that this was not a confrontation that escalated out of control, but rather an encounter that had been engineered to happen. And as this realization settled in, the case took on an entirely different weight, transforming from a tragic incident into something far more deliberate and deeply unsettling, because it meant that the victim had been targeted, not randomly, but specifically, chosen as the focus of a plan that would ultimately end in irreversible consequences. And when investigators began connecting this to the history of interactions between the people involved, the motive that once seemed unclear started to emerge with disturbing clarity, revealing a story rooted in emotional instability, jealousy, and an inability to accept circumstances that did not align with personal expectations. Because at the center of it all was a relationship that had never been clearly defined, one that existed in a gray area between casual and meaningful, where boundaries were unclear and expectations were never fully communicated. And within that uncertainty, another connection had formed, one that was far more intense, far more possessive, and ultimately far more dangerous. Because while one person moved forward with their life, navigating relationships without attachment, another became increasingly consumed by the idea of control, unable to separate perception from reality, unable to accept the independence of others, and instead choosing to interpret every interaction, every message, and every absence as something personal, something that needed to be addressed, corrected, or eliminated. And it was within that mindset that the decision was made, a decision that would set everything else into motion, because rather than stepping away, rather than accepting the situation for what it was, this individual chose to act, to insert themselves directly into the life of someone who had already made it clear that they wanted no involvement. And from that point forward, every action became part of a larger plan, from monitoring social media to tracking movements, from gathering information to determining the right moment to confront, all of it building toward a single objective that would eventually be carried out with devastating consequences. And when that moment finally came, it did not unfold as a simple conversation or a brief confrontation, but as an escalation that spiraled rapidly into violence, a struggle that left behind undeniable evidence of resistance, of fear, and of an attempt to survive, because the physical evidence told a story that words alone could not fully capture, a story of movement through confined spaces, of attempts to escape, of a fight that continued until there was no strength left to continue. And even after the act itself was complete, the behavior that followed further reinforced the idea that this had not been an accident or a moment of self-defense, because instead of seeking help, instead of reporting what had happened, there was an effort to conceal, to change appearance, to leave the scene in a way that would delay identification, actions that aligned more with evasion than fear, more with awareness than panic. And as investigators pieced together those moments, using surveillance footage, witness accounts, and forensic analysis, the case against the suspect became increasingly strong, forming a chain of evidence that connected each step of the journey from beginning to end, leaving little room for doubt about what had occurred and who was responsible. And when the arrest was finally made, it marked the transition from investigation to prosecution, shifting the focus from uncovering the truth to presenting it in a way that could be understood, evaluated, and ultimately judged within a courtroom, where every detail would be examined, every claim would be challenged, and every piece of evidence would be placed under scrutiny, because the defense would attempt to reshape the narrative, presenting an alternative version of events that framed the encounter as a reaction rather than a plan, as a response to immediate danger rather than a calculated decision, arguing that the actions taken were not driven by intent to harm, but by a perceived need to protect, a claim that would become central to the trial, forcing the court to consider not just what happened, but why it happened, and whether the explanation provided could reasonably align with the evidence presented. But as the prosecution laid out their case, step by step, They focused on the elements that contradicted that claim: the preparation, the travel, the deception, the attempt to conceal identity, all of which pointed toward premeditation rather than spontaneity, toward intent rather than reaction. And as witnesses took the stand, sharing their experiences, their observations, and their knowledge of the relationships involved, the emotional weight of the case became impossible to ignore, because this was not just about facts and timelines, but about the impact of those actions on real people, on a family that had lost someone they loved, on friends who were left trying to understand how something like this could happen. And as the trial progressed, the tension between these two narratives, one of calculated intent, the other of defensive reaction, became the central focus, with the outcome depending on which version the jury found more consistent with the evidence. And when the time came for deliberation, it did not take long for a decision to be reached, a decision that reflected not just the facts of the case, but the weight of the evidence that had been presented, leading to a verdict that brought a sense of closure to the legal process, even if it could never bring closure to the emotional reality of what had been lost. Because no verdict, no sentence, no outcome in a courtroom can truly resolve the absence left behind by a life taken too soon, and as the sentencing was delivered, it carried with it a recognition of the severity of the crime, of the planning, the intent, and the consequences that followed, resulting in a punishment that ensured the individual responsible would spend the remainder of their life facing the outcome of their actions, a decision that was meant not only to hold them accountable, but to acknowledge the gravity of what had occurred. And in the aftermath, as statements were given by those closest to the victim, the focus shifted from the details of the crime to the memory of the person at its center, a reminder that beyond the investigation, beyond the trial, beyond the headlines, there was a life that had been full of energy, kindness, and connection, a life that had touched others in ways that could not be measured by the events that ended it. And as those memories were shared, they served as a contrast to the darkness of what had happened, a way of reclaiming the narrative, of ensuring that the story did not begin and end with tragedy, but included the moments that came before it, the moments that defined who she truly was. And in that sense, the case became more than just an example of violence or a lesson in consequences. It became a reflection of how fragile normalcy can be, how quickly situations can escalate when emotions are left unchecked, and how important it is to recognize the signs of obsession, control, and instability before they reach a point where they can no longer be managed. Because while justice may provide answers and accountability, it cannot undo the past, it cannot restore what has been lost, and it cannot erase the impact of decisions made in moments where reason is replaced by emotion, leaving behind a story that serves as both a warning and a reminder that behind every case, every investigation, every courtroom proceeding, there are real lives, real relationships, and real consequences that extend far beyond the moment everything changed.